She stumbled to the gate of the Marsh Ranch, with her shoes worn clean through to bare feet, and her dress hanging off her shoulders like something borrowed from a scarecrow, and she went down in the dirt before she ever reached the porch. 3 days without food and 2 nights without sleep, finally catching up to a body that had been running on nothing but will. And it was not Gideon Marsh who found her first, and it was not old Zeke either, half dozing on the porch with his rifle across his knees. It was Birdie, 4 years old, barefoot herself, who had slipped out of the house chasing a barn cat, and instead found a stranger collapsed in the yard dust, with her ribs showing through a dress gone grey from wear. Birdie knelt down in the dirt beside her, small and solemn, and put one small hand flat against the stranger's cheek, the way she had once seen her own mother do to soothe a fever, and she said in the plain, unfiltered honesty that only a 4-year-old, and when the stranger, barely conscious, managed the ghost of a laugh and said, "Just hungry, little one." Birdie considered this with the enormous gravity of a child, deciding something that mattered more than anyone watching yet understood. And she leaned down close to the stranger's ear and whispered 5 words that would rearrange the whole shape of that ranch's future before the sun set on that same day. "Stay and be Mama, please." If you have ever shown up somewhere with nothing left in your hands but your own 2 open palms and found, against every reasonable expectation, that somebody there was willing to see you anyway, stay with this story to the very end, because it earns every minute of your time, and if it moves you even a little, tell me in the comments what town or city you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. And this one, more than most, is about what happens when a girl with nothing left but her own hands is finally handed a place to put them down. Clara Doyle had not set out that spring to become anybody's mother, or anybody's wife, or anybody's anything. She had set out only to survive the next mile, and then the mile after that, walking the wagon road out of Cedar Hollow, with her father's dead face and her mother's dead face, both still fresh enough in her memory to visit her most nights, 2 years gone now, to the same fever that had taken half the tenement block where they'd lived. And after that, and apprenticeship in Mrs. Pact, Iverson's dress shop that had promised food and a bed, and delivered, instead, 16-hour days, and a woman whose cruelty ran in currents so quiet that nobody outside the shop ever quite believed it when Clara tried, once. It had come to a head 3 days before, when a length of good silk had gone missing from the back room, and Mrs. Iverson, needing someone to blame and finding Clara conveniently poor and conveniently friendless, had accused her outright, in front of the whole shop, of theft, and had threatened the county sheriff, and Clara, who had spent 2 years learning exactly how little the word of an orphan seamstress's apprentice was worth against the word of a respectable shop owner, had done the only thing left to a person with nothing to defend herself but her own 2 feet, with the clothes on her back and her mother's brass thimble sewn into her hem where nobody could take it from her, and she had walked the wagon road for 3 days believing, with the particular flat certainty of the truly desperate, that she was walking toward nothing at all, only away from something worse. She built a private rule out of that walking, the way a person builds calluses, 1 blister at a time. She did not cry where anyone could see her, because tears cost water she could not spare, and pity she had learned not to trust. She never asked for 1 ounce more than the bare minimum owed her, because asking was how Mrs. McKee Iversons of the world decided you were a burden worth discarding, and when praise or credit came looking for her, he handed it away before it could land, because being noticed in her short and hard experience was how good things got taken from you by people who decided you didn't deserve them after all. She carried her mother's brass thimble the way another woman might carry a locket, worn smooth on one side, from being turned over and over between finger and thumb in the dark, the last physical thing left in the world that had touched her mother's living hand, and she was turning it over in her pocket, half delirious with hunger, when she went down in the dust of the Marsh Ranch yard and heard a small, solemn voice ask her if she was an angel. Gideon Marsh came around the side of the barn at his daughter's raised voice, expecting trouble of the kind that came at a man in this country, a rattler, a stray bull, a drifter with bad intentions, and found instead his youngest child kneeling in the dirt beside a collapsed stranger, whispering something into the girl's ear that he did not catch. And he stood there for one long moment, taking in the whole of it, the rag-worn dress, the bare, blistered feet, the thin wrists, the particular stillness of a body that has stopped fighting exhaustion and simply surrendered to it. He was not by nature a man who took in strays. 2 years of grief had narrowed him down to the bare functional minimum required to keep 4 children breathing and a ranch from collapsing outright, and strangers, in his experience, were one more obligation he had no spare capacity left to carry. But Rebecca, his wife, 2 years in the ground now, dead in the same childbed that had given him June, Rebecca had never once in her life turned away a hungry person from their door, and some old habit of hers, worn into him the way water wears a channel into rock, moved his feet before his tired mind had finished arguing against it. And he crossed the yard and lifted Clara Doyle up into his arms the way he might have lifted a lamb caught in barbed wire. And he carried her into the house, and he said to his eldest daughter, Louisa, standing white-faced in the doorway, "Get broth on, and the good quilt off my bed." And that was how it started. She slept for a day and a night. When she woke, it was to the sound of a baby crying somewhere close, an unrelenting, worn, thin wail that had clearly been going on in one form or another for longer than any household could bear, gracefully, and to the sight of a girl of about 14 standing in the doorway with a face gone grey from exhaustion. This was Louisa, called Lou by everyone who loved her, and Louisa by everyone she was tired of managing. And she had been running that household, the cooking, the mending, the baby, her 3 younger siblings for 2 years with a competence far beyond her years and a resentment about it that she had never once been permitted to voice out loud. Because who complains to a grieving father about the unfairness of being forced to become a mother at 14? Lou looked at Clara with her arms crossed and said, without any preamble at all, "Pa says you can stay a week to get your strength up. After that, you'll want to be moving on to family somewhere, I expect." It was not a question. It was a hope, dressed up as a fact, the hope of an exhausted child that this stranger's presence would be brief and would not require her to hand over any more of the fragile order she had built out of pure stubbornness. Clara, sitting up slowly against the pillows, looked back at her with the flat honesty that was the closest thing she had to a gift, and said, "I have no family anywhere, Miss Lou, not one living soul. But I don't intend to be a burden on yours either. Point me toward the mending basket, and I'll earn my broth." Lou's arms stayed crossed, but something in her face flickered, because in 2 years of well-meaning neighbor women bringing casseroles and useless sympathy, nobody had once offered her, plainly, to take a piece of the work off her hands. The rest of the household introduced themselves to Clara the way a wary pack introduces itself to an unfamiliar animal, one at a time, testing. Toby, 11, the middle child, met her with his jaw set and his fists loosely curled, and announced that he didn't need a hired girl telling him what to do, ever, about anything, and Clara, recognizing the shape of that fury from the inside, she had worn that exact armor herself in Mrs. B. Iverson's shop, said only, "I wasn't planning on telling you what to do. I was planning on asking if you'd show me where the wood's kept, since I don't know this place, and you clearly do." Toby, thrown by being asked instead of instructed, showed her the woodpile without further argument, and something in his shoulders came down a degree that nobody but Clara noticed. Wren, 7, said nothing at all. Communicating instead through small wooden animals, she whittled with a pocket knife too large for her hands, lining them up along the windowsill in patterns only she understood, and she had not spoken a full sentence aloud since the day her mother died delivering June. Though the household had long since stopped remarking on it the way a person stops remarking on a familiar ache. And baby June, 10 months old, cried nearly without pause, because a house running on the bare functional minimum has very little soothing left over to spend on an infant, and her crying had become, though nobody said this out loud either, a kind of barometer the whole family measured its days by, worse on the hard days, marginally better on the good ones. Never once, in 2 years, entirely quiet. Clara did not go to the fields first, nor even to the mending, though the mending basket was in truth what drew her, overflowing and years behind, shirts with torn elbows and trousers with blown-out knees, and a household of children dressed, essentially, in rags held together by hope. She went first to the baby. She picked June up from the cradle where she'd been left to cry while Lou wrestled with a scorched supper, and she held her the way her own mother had once held her, close against the collarbone where a heartbeat could be felt and trusted, and she hummed low and tuneless an old work song from the tenement block she'd grown up in, and June, astonishingly, hiccuped twice and went quiet, staring up at this new, unfamiliar face with the enormous, solemn attention only babies and very old people seem to have left in them. Lou watched this from the stove, with the scorched supper forgotten in her hand, and something in her chest, wound tight for 2 years, loosened by the smallest possible degree, not trust yet, but the mere absence, for one held breath, of having to carry the whole weight alone. Then Clara went to the mending basket, and she did not stop for 3 days patching and turning collars and letting down hems, and by the end of the week every child in that house had at least one whole garment to their name that did not have a single visible tear in it, and it was Wren, small and silent, who first came and sat beside her at the mending table without being invited, watching Clara's needle move with an intensity that suggested she recognized something of her own patient. Careful, wordless craft in it, and one evening Wren set down, without a word, a small wooden bird she had whittled, rough but clearly meant to be a wren, and pushed it across the table toward Clara, and Clara understood this for the gift it was, and said only, "Thank you." I'll keep her close, and put the little bird in her apron pocket beside her mother's brass thimble, and Wren, satisfied, went back to her whittling, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. Gideon Marsh watched all of this from the edges of his own exhausted grief, the way a man watches weather change from inside a house. He no longer quite trusts to keep him dry. With a wary, hopeful disbelief he did not yet know how to name. He was a man built along broad, plain lines, physically imposing in the way of men who have spent a lifetime hauling and building and breaking horses, and entirely unreachable in every way that mattered since the day Rebecca died, communicating what love he had left almost exclusively through small acts of provision, a fresh split woodpile left outside a door, a rabbit skinned and left on the counter without comment, a blanket laid quietly over a sleeping child. He had a way of starting sentences he could not finish, beginning some vulnerable admission and then stopping cold before the soft part, as though the words themselves might cost him something he could not afford to spend, and Clara noticed this within the first fortnight, the way he'd say, "that the children have," and then simply stop, leave the sentence hanging in the kitchen air like an unfinished fence, and pick up his hat instead and go out to the barn. It was the drought that summer that first forced them together in a way neither of them had planned for. 6 weeks without rain turned the low pasture to cracked clay and the creek to a trickle a man could step over dry shod, and Gideon Marsh, watching his herd's water dwindle toward nothing, made the decision that half the ranchers in the county were making that same week to drive the cattle 8 miles north to the old spring on Cotton's leased land, a decision that required every able hand the ranch had, and Clara, without being asked, saddled the one gentle mare left in the barn and rode alongside Toby and old Zeke to help push the herd, working from before dawn until well past dark for 4 straight days in dust so thick it caked in the creases of her hands, and on the 3rd night, making camp under a hard, star-crusted sky with the cattle finally settled and quiet. Gideon Marsh sat across the low fire from her, and in the particular loosened honesty that comes to tired people in the dark, began, "I never expected, when Birdie brought you in from that yard, that you'd," and stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished the way it always did. And Clara, tired enough herself to stop minding her own careful rules for once, said plainly, "You can finish a sentence around me, Mr. Marsh. I won't take it as a debt owed." He looked at her for a long moment across the fire, and something in his broad, tired face moved just slightly, and he said that you'd feel like a person the house could lean on again. And then he looked immediately embarrassed to have said it whole, and busied himself banking the fire. And Clara sat very still, with her mother's thimble warm in her pocket, and did not say anything at all, because some sentences, once finished, need to sit in the quiet a while before anyone tries to answer them. They brought the herd through that drought with only 2 head lost, better than most of the county managed, and word of it travelled the way word travels in small places, quietly at first. And that was the first time Prudence Ashworth's name entered the story in a way that mattered. Prudence Ashworth ran the Cedar Hollow Ladies' Aid Society, the way other women ran a household, completely, and through channels nobody could quite name, deciding by force of personality and a long memory for slights exactly which families in the county deserve sympathy. When she heard that Gideon Marsh had brought his herd through the worst drought in a decade nearly whole, credit going quietly around town to a hired girl of unknown origin who'd ridden out with the men for 4 days straight, she did not hear a story of competence. She heard, instead, the particular scandal she had been waiting 2 years to find a foothold for, a woman of no known family, unchaperoned, alone on the range for days at a time with a widower and his hired hand, in a household already talked about for its disorder since Rebecca Marsh's death. She began, in the careful, deniable way of a woman who has never once raised her voice to do real damage, to talk, to the minister's wife first, then to the ladies at the dry goods counter, and then most dangerously to Elias Cotton, who held the note on the Marsh Ranch at the Territorial Bank and had watched Gideon Marsh's operation limp along on the thin edge of solvency, waiting, quietly, for a reason to call it due. The reason Prudence Ashworth handed him was simple and deniable in exactly the way bank business always is. A household fallen into such disgrace that its master could not be trusted to manage his own affairs soberly was, in the careful language bankers use when they mean something else entirely. Cotton did not call the note outright. He simply let it be known over the following weeks that renewal of the loan come autumn was no longer a certainty, and that certain demonstrations of order and respectability would weigh heavily on his decision. And Gideon Marsh, a man who had never in his life known how to fight a battle, went silent and grey under the weight of it in a way his children recognized with a sick, familiar dread, because they had watched him go silent like that once before. In the months after their mother died, and they were terrified of watching him disappear into it again. Lou heard the talk first, the way daughters always hear things at church that fathers never do, and she came home white-faced and told Clara everything out by the woodpile where Gideon would not overhear, and Clara listened without her face changing at all, because that was her rule beneath the rule. Never let them see it land. But that night, sitting on the porch step, long after the house had gone dark, turning her mother's brass thimble over and over between finger and thumb, she let herself feel, for one private hour, the full weight of the particular fury that comes from watching people who have never once gone hungry decide from a position of total safety, whose reputation deserves protecting and whose deserves burning. She did not go to Prudence Ashworth's parlor to argue. That was never her way. Instead, she did what she had always done with trouble. She picked up a needle, because a needle, unlike an argument, could not be talked over or twisted into gossip, only proven true or false by the work it produced. She had noticed, mending through that overflowing basket those first weeks, the particular fineness of her own stitching, taught to her by a mother who had once sewn for a fine house back east before poverty caught up with the family, and she had noticed, too, riding north with the herd, 40 miles distant, grumbling about the poor quality and short supply of winter coats and quilted bedding for the coming season. She sat down one evening with Lou, who had a good head for figures even if nobody had ever thought to ask her to use it for anything beyond household accounts, and the two of them worked out, on the back of an old ledger page, exactly what materials and hours it would take to produce 100 quilted coat linings and blankets of a quality the army quartermaster would pay real coin for, and Clara took that figure and her own two rough, capable hands and rode into Cedar Hollow to speak with Doc Abernathy, the one man in town whose good opinion could not be bought or gossiped out of him, a widower himself, who had delivered half the county and buried the other half, and had exactly no patience left in his life for cruelty dressed up as concern. Doc Abernathy looked over her sample stitching at his kitchen table with his spectacles low on his nose and said, "Girl, I've seen army issue coats with worse seams than this." And when she told him her plan, plainly, he said, "I'll write the quartermaster myself. He owes me a favor from a fever season I don't care to discuss." And from that day forward, Doc Abernathy was, quietly and completely, on her side. The contract came through within the month, 100 quilted coat linings and 50 wool-batted blankets, to be delivered before the first snow. Real money against a ranch that badly needed it. And Clara organized the whole household around the work, the way a general organizes a campaign. Lou cutting patterns with her newly discovered gift for figures keeping the material accounts, Toby splitting his core time to haul batting and firewood for the long sewing evenings, even Wren finding her quiet place in the operation. Sorting scraps by color into careful piles that turned out, quite without anyone planning it, to be exactly the kind of eye for pattern the quilt tops needed. Gideon Marsh, watching his kitchen table become a workshop humming with purpose for the first time in 2 years, found himself standing in doorways more often than he used to, just looking the way a man looks at rain finally coming to a drought-cracked field. It was in the second week of that sewing push that baby June's fever came on, sudden and hard, the way fevers come to the smallest and weakest first. And for 2 days and 2 nights, the whole household narrowed down to that one small crib. Lou did not sleep. Toby sat outside the sick-room door with his knees pulled up to his chest, refusing to be sent to bed, saying nothing, which for Toby was its own kind of screaming. Wren sat in the corner with her whittling knife still and unused in her lap, watching the door. Birdie would not leave Clara's skirts, murmuring lavender and clean linen. Lavender and clean linen, the two things she remembered of her mother's hands over and over, like a small prayer whose stakes she did not fully understand. And Gideon Marsh, a man who had stood dry-eyed through his wife's burial because he believed a father was not permitted to break in front of his children, sat by the crib on the second night with his big hands hanging useless between his knees, and when Doc Abernathy came out from checking June's fever and said only, "It could go either way before morning," Gideon put his face in his hands, and for the first time in 2 years, wept silently, his shoulders shaking, and it was Clara who crossed the room and put her hand flat against his back. Not a caress, just a plain fact of steady pressure, the way you might brace a fence post leaning hard in wind. I have seen it in her already, the way she fights that fever like it owes her money, and Gideon Marsh, who did not cry in front of anyone, did not stop crying, but he let her hands stay there, and something in that sick room shifted permanently in that hour, something that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the plain, unglamorous fact of two exhausted people holding a household up together instead of each carrying it alone. June's fever broke near dawn on the third day, and the whole house exhaled at once, and it was Lou, of all of them, who finally broke apart, sobbing into Clara's shoulder in the kitchen while the men slept, saying, "I've been trying to be her for 2 years. I've been trying to be Mama, and I can't. I'm so tired, I can't." And Clara held her the way she imagined a mother held a child, though she had had precious little practice at either end of that exchange, and said, "You do not have to be her. You only have to be Lou." That has always been enough, and Lou cried harder at that, the particular relief of being released from a job nobody should have handed a 14-year-old in the first place. And from that morning on, something in Lou's shoulders came down and stayed down. It was 10 days after June's fever broke that the sewing house, the old bunkhouse Gideon had cleared out and fitted with tables for the quilting work, their whole 100-coat contract, stacked and half-finished inside it, caught fire in the small hours of the night. Nobody ever determined for certain how it started. A lamp left too near dry batting, most likely, though Doc Abernathy would say later, quietly, to Clara alone, that he had his suspicions it had been set. Given how conveniently it happened 4 days before the quartermaster's delivery deadline, and how thoroughly it would have ended the whole venture if the fire had reached the finished goods stacked at the far wall. It was Wren who woke first, Wren who had not spoken a full sentence aloud in 2 years, and Wren stood in the hallway and screamed, actually screamed, one raw and enormous word, "Fire." The first word the household had heard from her in all that time, and the shock of it was nearly lost entirely in the chaos of what came after. Because within minutes the bunkhouse was a wall of orange against the black sky, and Gideon Marsh was already running toward it, with nothing on his feet. They fought that fire with everything the ranch had, buckets from the well, wet blankets snatched from the very stock they were trying to save, old Zeke riding bareback to raise the neighbors, and neighbors came, the way they do in that country when the alternative is watching a family lose everything. Riders arriving out of the dark from 3 different spreads, with water barrels and shovels and grim-set faces, and among them, astonishingly, came Prudence Ashworth's own housekeeper, Mrs. Medini, Purcell, who had heard the bell from town and saddled a horse without asking anyone's leave, because Mrs. Purcell had watched her employer's whisper campaign against a hard-working girl for months, with a growing disgust she had never once been permitted to voice in that woman's parlor. And a fire, it turned out, was exactly the kind of emergency that made silence feel like its own species of cruelty. They saved most of the finished goods, hauled clear of the flames by Toby and Clara, working in a smoke-choked dark that would have felled a grown man twice their size. They lost the bunkhouse structure itself, a total loss by morning, But the contract survived, singed at the edges but whole, and half the county had now stood shoulder to shoulder with Clara Doyle in a bucket line at 3 a.m. and had seen, with their own eyes, exactly what kind of person she was. Gideon Marsh stood in the grey dawn light, looking at the smoking ruin of the bunkhouse, and for a moment his face went the particular slack colour of a man watching one more thing end. And Clara, filthy with soot, her hands blistered from hauling wet canvas, came and stood beside him and said quietly, "We'll finish the order in the main house. Every table we own, if we have to. We are not losing this contract to a fire." And Gideon Marsh looked at her, soot-streaked and exhausted and entirely undefeated, already planning the next step, while the ashes were still warm, and something in his chest that had been sealed shut for 2 years came loose. Not all at once, but the way ice comes loose from a riverbank in spring. One long, groaning crack. That means the whole thing is finally about to move. Cotton came out to the ranch himself 4 days later, expecting, Clara suspected, to find a household too broken by scandal and misfortune to meet its obligations, ready to accept whatever terms the bank wished to name on the note. He found instead 100 quilted coat linings and 50 wool blankets, stacked clean and finished on the kitchen table, a signed receipt already in hand from the quartermaster's rider who'd come through the day before, and Doc Abernathy sitting, uninvited but entirely at home, in the good chair by the window. Clara laid the delivery receipt and the contract payment in front of him, and said, in the plain, unhurried voice she had built for herself out of 2 years of practice at not being believed, "The note comes due in 6 weeks, Mr. Cotton. This payment covers it twice over, with money left besides. I would ask that you renew on the original terms your own bank wrote 2 years back, not on whatever new terms the talk in town has been suggesting to you lately." Cotton's face went through several colours. Doc Abernathy, from the good chair, said mildly, "I'd hate for the Territorial Examiner to hear a note got called on a family that just paid it in full. Elias? Looks poorly on a bank's judgment, that kind of thing." Cotton renewed the note that afternoon, on the original terms, and he did not come back out to the Marsh Ranch again. It was at the harvest social at fall, the last of it came apart in the open, the way these things sometimes need to, in daylight, where everyone can see the true shape of a thing once it's finally let out of the dark. Prudence Ashworth, sensing perhaps that her authority in Cedar Hollow was slipping badly, made one final brittle attempt at the church hall that evening, remarking loudly enough for half the room to hear that some people ought to remember their place, that a runaway shop girl of unproven character was still a runaway shop girl, no matter how many quilts she'd stitched, and that respectable families did not let strange women run their households unchaperoned. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone present already knows the answer and is simply waiting to see who says it first. It was Mrs. Purcell who said it. Prudence Ashworth's own housekeeper, who had pressed her linens and kept her house for 6 years, and never once spoken out of turn, set down her punch cup and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that hall, that she had ridden out to a fire at 3 a.m. and found a supposedly disgraced runaway standing waist-deep in smoke-hauling government coats to safety with her own bare, blistered hands, while certain other women of this town, whose names she would not trouble herself to say, had stayed warm in their beds and only found their courage the next morning in gossip. Doc Abernathy stood next, and said he'd stake his medical reputation on Clara Doyle's character against anyone's in the county, and that he'd seen her sit up 3 nights straight over a sick child that wasn't hers by blood. Old Zeke stood, creaking, and said she'd ridden out a drought at his side and never once complained where any man could hear it. And Gideon Marsh, who had not said a public word about any of it in all these months, stood last and crossed the room in front of everyone and took Clara's hand right there in front of the whole of Cedar Hollow and said, "This is the woman who kept my family standing when I did not have it in me. I don't much care what this hall thinks about where she came from or what shop she ran from. I care what she's built here, and what she's built is a home." Prudence Ashworth left the Harvest Social early that evening, and though she remained in Cedar Hollow some years after, she was never again quite so certain, in public, of whose place was whose. It was on the porch some weeks later, in the particular blue hour, when the black window goes grey and the crickets give way to the first birds, that Gideon Marsh finally said the rest of what that hand-taking had promised. He began the way he always began the hard sentences, starting and stopping. "Clara, I've been trying to find a way to say," and stopped, the way he always stopped, right before the vulnerable part. And Clara, who had learned by now every shape of his silences, said gently, "You do that. You start the true sentence, and then you leave before the end of it, like you're afraid the words will cost you something." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face cracked the rest of the way open, the last of the ice coming off the riverbank. "And," he said, "they do cost something. Everything I've said true has cost me. Rebecca, near enough the ranch itself, I stopped saying true things because every time I did, I lost something. And now," she asked, "now I think I've been losing more by not saying them," he said. And then he said the rest of it plainly, the way she had taught the whole household to say hard things, that he loved her, that his children loved her, that the ranch and the house and every stitched thing in it were more hers by now than his by any measure that mattered but the deed, and that he was asking her if she would have it, to make that true on paper as well as in fact. Clara Doyle, who had built a private rule out of never asking for more than the bare minimum owed her, who had spent a lifetime handing credit away before it could land on her and mark her as someone worth watching, sat very still with her mother's thimble warm in her palm, and she said, "I did not come here to be given anything, Gideon. I came here starving, and your daughter asked me to stay." "She asked you to stay and be her mamma," Gideon said. "What do you say to that now, all this time on?" And Clara Doyle, who did not cry where anyone could see her, found that her rule, for the first time in her whole hard life, simply did not apply any more, because some things are worth being seen for, and she let him see it, and she said, "Not because you're asking, because I already have been since the day she whispered it." They were married in the spring, in the shade of the rebuilt bunkhouse, its new roof set higher against the next fire that might come, with the whole valley in attendance. Wren, who had found her voice back in the smoke of that fire and had not lost it since, read a small poem she'd written herself, badly rhymed and entirely sincere, about hands that mend and hands that hold, and there was not a dry eye among the older women who understood exactly what she meant by it. Toby stood at his father's side, 12 now, and no longer needing his fists curled against the world. Lou, freed at last of a job no child should have carried, laughed for the first time in years at something old Zeke said, an easy, unguarded, girlish laugh that made her father's throat go tight all over again, this time with something other than grief. Birdie Five now still murmured her old 2 words sometimes, lavender and clean linen, but she had added a third to the litany that spring, a new memory, flower and wood smoke, that belonged to a living woman instead of only a lost one, and nobody who watched her say it that day mistook it for anything but healing. And baby June, walking steady now, crossed the churchyard grass toward the woman who had sat up 3 nights running to save her, and fell, laughing, and was caught, the way she always was, before she ever hit the ground. Clara wore, that day, a wedding dress made from the very first quilt she had ever pieced in that house, cut down and remade, every rag and scrap in it, a small history of the family that had taken her in. And when Gideon saw it, he understood without needing a single word explained to him. Exactly what she was telling the whole valley, that she had arrived in rags, and she intended the whole of Cedar Hollow to watch what she had made of them. The years that followed the wedding did not unfold without their own trials, because no life worth telling ever does. But the Marsh Ranch grew steadily from those foundations, the way a single careful stitch grows, in time, into a whole quilt strong enough to last 100 winters. Clara's quilting enterprise, begun as a desperate scramble to save one note from one banker, grew within a decade into the finest weaving and needlework operation in the territory, supplying not only the fort, but ranches and towns 200 miles in every direction. Her name spoken with respect in rooms she would once never have been permitted to enter. Women who had once whispered about a runaway shopgirl of no known family sent their own daughters to learn stitching at her table. Bankers who had once weighed her character against a ledger of gossip came, hats in hand, asking after her opinion on credit for the coming season. And the children who had once stood in that ranch house in a wall of grief and suspicion grew into the kind of adults who never once in all their lives forgot what it had cost her to stay, and never once let her forget what it had meant that she chose to. Old Zeke used to tell it in later years to anyone who'd sit still long enough on the porch to hear it. A girl had come stumbling up the wagon road with nothing to her name but a mother's brass thimble sewn into her hem, half-starved and running from a cruelty that had tried to convince her she was worth nothing at all, and how a 4-year-old child, with no reasoning beyond the plain honesty children are still permitted, had looked at that ragged stranger and seen, before any grown person in the county managed to exactly what she was worth. He'd tell how the rags had become quilts, and the quilts had become a livelihood, and the livelihood had become the anchor that held a broken, grieving household together long enough to heal, and how, in time, without anyone quite noticing the moment it happened, a ranch that had been quietly dying of its own sorrow became instead the warmest house for 50 miles. And that, Zeke always said, setting his coffee down at the end of it, was the whole of the lesson in it, that a person's worth was never measured by the state of the clothes they arrived in or the reputation a cruel woman tried to pin to their back, but by what they were willing to build, stitch by careful stitch, pecks out of the very scraps other people had already thrown away, and that a mother, in the truest sense of the word, was never only the woman who bore you. She was the woman who knelt down in the dust when you had nothing left, and stayed and kept staying for as long as it took to turn rags into a home,